Next Chapter Podcasts.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
But I read books and I learned that not everybody was like me, that there were people that were different. And I learned to be a more empathetic person.
Now, what courts have decided over the years is that when it comes to curriculum, right, teachers do not have First Amendment rights and do not have academic freedom to curriculum. So what Florida lawmakers learned was, well, we don't need to target the professors, we target the curriculum. And if we can get into the curriculum, then nobody has standing.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Hello, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumoftheNewSouth.org. Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone of the Washington Post, coming to you from the University of Maryland, where I teach. And I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Robert Greene II, a professor of history at Claflin University. Our New South Season 2 explores the complexities of the many New Souths that make up today's New South. The series highlights opportunities and challenges that different communities face, diving into censorship and healthcare, tourism and religion, struggles for rights and resources, and the global reverberations of New South culture.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the show a Sickle Award and Anthem Award winner. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South focuses on the subject of censoring education.
We are eager to share these compelling conversations with our accomplished guests about a subject that may turn some heads.
That's right, Kevin. It's become quite controversial in recent years, specifically how and what is taught in schools from early to higher education.
But before we get to our guest, Robert, I would like to ask you to provide us with some brief insight on historical education in the South.
In recent years, debates have raged across the country about what young people should be taught about our nation's history. Arguments over both the 1619 Project, about the importance of slavery to America's past and present, and the meaning of critical race theory, inside and outside the classroom, along with the rise and fall of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives on college campuses and in corporate America, have caused a severe backlash toward learning about the most unsavory aspects of American and especially Southern history. Book bans in public libraries have also become all too commonplace, with states such as South Carolina leading the way in removing books that the Board of Education deems to have, quote, sexual conduct, end quote. Meanwhile, the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which has muzzled teachers and professors alike in Florida on issues involving race and ethnicity, are but part of a long history of the suppression of education in Southern life. As with so many other elements of Southern society, any discussion of censorship must begin with slavery. The U.S. South allowed no dissent on the topic. Abolitionist literature was famously burned by over 3,000 people in Charleston, South Carolina in 1835. After the American Civil War, white Southerners attempted to rewrite the cause of the war, from a defense of slavery to protecting an ambiguous idea of states' rights, described as a lost cause that the white South was not embarrassed to fight and die for. These ideas about the war's meaning would spread throughout the nation, while Black Americans and progressive white allies insisted for well over a century that the war was about slavery. Southern suppression of education touched on other subjects throughout the 20th century. The Scopes monkey trial of 1925 became a referendum on how much impact evangelical Christianity would have on education in the South. Southern governments targeted faculty who worked at historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, during the Civil Rights Movement for their supporting the activism of their students. In recent years, the conversations about how to teach that era of history have become fraught with danger, as Republicans have taken the lead on legislation designed to target explicit and even implicit discussion of the impact of racism and discrimination on American and Southern history, life, and modern society. However, there are attempts to push back against this. Churches and freedom schools alike have offered a different path, teaching tough histories outside the constrained walls of public K-12 schools and universities. Professors, teachers, and librarians are also fighting back, often via the only and best way they know how, through education and the nurturing of learning. The South's history can be a difficult one to learn. It is only made harder when we do not learn from it. Our first guest is Amanda Jones. Amanda is a school librarian joining us from her home state of Louisiana.
She is also the author of That Librarian, The Fight Against Book Banning in America, published in 2024, which details her position on book bans and the serious persecution she has faced as a result. Our New South welcomes Amanda Jones. All right. Well, Amanda Jones, welcome to Our New South. Thank you for doing this. We've been looking forward to it. And as always, we like to have our guests introduce themselves to our audience. So I'll ask you to tell folks your name, where you're at, and where you're from.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Amanda Jones, and I am a 24-year educator, current school librarian, and I live in Watson, Louisiana, which is about 30 minutes outside of Baton Rouge.
So what is it about the library that made you want to make a career out of being a librarian? Was that something in your childhood that you were attracted to?
Yes. I remember my mom is a retired kindergarten teacher, and she made a very big deal about when we turned 5 going to get our public library card. And so I've had my library card since I was young, but also she read to us every single night. And she always encouraged us to read, and she made sure we had access to books and there were never any restrictions. She just let us read what we wanted to read. And I think that just it developed this huge love of reading for me. And I don't know what I would do without books in my life. And I just in turn want to, I went into education to teach children, but also as a school librarian so that I can help kids maybe foster that love of reading and help them become lifelong readers as well.
And I think there needs to be a reminder as to how you wound up writing the book that you wrote and getting involved in this controversy.
Yeah, I'm an accidental activist. I didn't set out to be. I mean, I've always been an advocate and outspoken about censorship and standing up for intellectual freedom for school libraries and public libraries. But I'm a school librarian by trade, but I kind of stepped into the controversy because I went and spoke as a resident of my community at our public library board. And our public library board has become the target of extremists. And it's a group of extremists that have been instrumental in costing neighboring public library systems millions in funding. And they're relocating books, and extremists have taken over their library board. So when I saw that they had turned their sights on our parish, because we're parishes, not counties in Louisiana. And so I knew I had to go speak. So I just wrote a speech and went and spoke as a resident. And so many other people did as well. In fact, I thought my speech was tame compared to some of the others, but it didn't sit well with the extremists. And I woke up 4 days after that public library board meeting and found myself the target of a harassment campaign, very targeted harassment campaign just against me. I'm the only one that spoke that night out of 30 that they've targeted. And that was 2.5 years ago, and they haven't stopped. They're still doing it. But it just set forth a series of events where I became, I guess, an activist. They wanted to silence me, and I refused to be silent. And so I did the opposite. And so I continue to speak out as often as I can. And then I got offered a book deal about it. So, I mean, you can't turn down a book deal.
That's right. and what danger do you think you pose to those who so vehemently and vilely opposed you?
Well, I've never thought about how they might see me as dangerous. I am a danger to, they're obviously they're bigots, and they're homophobic, and they're racist, and they want to silence historically marginalized voices, and they want to defund schools and libraries. And I guess I'm dangerous because I speak out against what they're doing, and I call them out, and I'll call them out by name, and I go and speak against it. And I ended up helping found an organization called Louisiana Citizens Against Censorship. And as a coalition, we built a coalition of people all across the state of Louisiana. So I guess you could say I'm dangerous because we helped defeat 7.5 of the 9 anti-library bills last legislative session, which I say a half because we got the 8th one so watered down with amendments it's obsolete almost.
One last thing before I hand it over to Professor Greene. But one of the things that just struck me about this whole movement that ensnared you was that most of the states that had the most book bans were in the South. And I think back, we're almost 100 years now since the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. And I was just wondering what that tells you about the South that you may know through history and the South that you're in now.
Well, I mean, the South lost the Civil War. It's they like to hold fast to these harmful ideas in the South. I thought it was only happening in the South, but speaking to librarians all across the country now, I didn't realize it. I thought at first it was just a Southern issue, but it's actually, I've spoken to librarians that it's happening in every single state. Just that it's such local fights. It's such local individual fights in every little town and parish and county. But the majority of those as a whole are happening in the South. You're seeing Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Texas. And the South has always been the slowest to want to change. Look at the civil rights era, and you look at, the South is a lot slower and to change and learn and grow. And I always had hope, though, that we were getting better. And I don't know if I was just being naive or not paying attention, or I thought we were getting better, that more and more people in the South were speaking out for equality and with empathy and inclusivity and diversity. But the past few years have made me realize we haven't come nearly as far as I thought we had. We seem to be going backwards.
Well, and Amanda, I think you have every reason in the world to be concerned. And when we first invited you on the program, I was deeply intrigued by your story. And as a fellow Southerner and also a fellow lifelong reader and learner, I am especially intrigued about what you think this all says about the South. And you're already talking about this now, but has this whole ordeal changed how you have viewed the South? Because you just said that you thought things were changing for the better, but now it seems things are going in reverse.
Well, and I hate to generalize the South because I do see lots of people fighting. It's just that we're outnumbered in the South. I really did think we were getting better, but I still view the South as maybe a little behind. We always tend to fall last on like every survey. We're last, in education, or we're tied usually with Alabama or Arkansas, and last in education, highest in, opioid crisis, and, highest in all the bad things and lowest in all the good things. And I think we can do better. But what I think is that our politicians have a stronghold on a lot of things that keep us held down. And I think that you look at historically who's been in positions of power in the United States, white straight men, and that tends to be a lot of the leaders in the South, white straight men. And they are fearful that when you start including other people that don't look like them, that aren't white straight men, they start being fearful of losing their power. So they start doing everything they can, which we see they're trying to stop learning and growing. And, they're attacking libraries, they're attacking public education, they're attacking historically marginalized communities, like immigrants and just anybody that's not white and straight is being maligned by the politicians in the South.
And as a quick follow-up, could you talk a little bit about, on the one hand, we've been talking a lot about the opposition you faced, but could you talk about the people who have supported you in this endeavor, both those who are in the South and nationally as well?
Yes. So right after I spoke at the Public Library Board of Control meeting 2.5 years ago, there were some very awful memes and posts on social media about me saying that I teach children how to perform sex acts. I give pornography and erotica to 6-year-olds. None of that I do, and I didn't say anything like that in my speech. And so I saw my community turn on me, a lot of people in my community. And it wasn't that everybody in my community turned on me. It's that the ones who didn't turn on me, the ones that were my friends, weren't vocal in support locally. And I try to understand that they didn't want to be harassed either. And there's this fear involved. But outside of my community, everyone has been wonderful. I have librarian friends and educator friends all across the country that stepped in immediately. My friend Casey Boyd, who is a school librarian in Washington, D.C., stepped in immediately and rallied everybody for me. And everyone from across the United States came out to support me. Not only that, but as my story spread, I started getting letters in the mail, letters at school. I got letters at my local bookstore that please give this to Amanda Jones. And it was just letters of support, like, you're doing the right thing. Keep doing what you're doing. And yeah, I got some death threats and I got some awful, but for every one death threat I got, I would get 1,000 positive emails and letters and things like that.
And so what is really the importance of untethered reading materials for young people, for communities, for schools that brings you to fight like you have?
Books have the ability to shape lives, but also save lives. I think about the way I talk about a lot of how I grew up. I grew up on Alice Walker's The Color Purple. I grew up on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. I grew up on Oprah's book club. I watched it every week. Like, what's Oprah going to talk about this week that I need to read? And I had a very good high school librarian that introduced me to Dr. Maya Angelou and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and all of the poems. And I had a good history teacher that had us listen to Martin Luther King Jr. speeches, not just read them but listen to them and digest them. And learning and growing is so important. And it builds books that have I grew up very privileged, middle class. My parents are still together. We didn't suffer for anything really growing up, but I read books and I learned that not everybody was like me, that there were people that were different. And I learned to be a more empathetic person. So books are very powerful tools, but they also teach us things about history so that we don't have to repeat our mistakes, which is what they're trying to ban books that teach history. And so that we don't learn from them. And they don't want us to learn from our mistakes in the past. They want to whitewash everything and say everything was great. And it wasn't.
A lot of my colleagues in academia have talked about how Generation Z, they're coming to college, they aren't reading as much as the previous generations did. What are you seeing with students right now in terms of folks who go to the library, read books? What are you seeing are their reading habits and what they're consuming as readers?
So my students are 9, 10, and 11. They are voracious readers. And the age group that I teach is like the age that, in elementary, kids are taught to love to read and they read all the time. And then it sort of tapers off in middle school and junior high. And it's very important to me that kids should have a really strong, reading teacher and librarian at that middle grade, because that's like a make or break time where you can, completely turn them off of reading, or you can foster it and keep them going. But our students are voracious readers, and their favorite books are graphic novels. They cannot get enough of graphic novels. They love, anything graphic novels, and they love classics that have been turned into graphic novels. And they love, one of their favorites is Jerry Craft, who wrote the book New Kid. And there's it's a 3-book series. They love Jerry Craft. They love historical fiction, graphic novels, but also historical fiction in general. They love reading about the Holocaust and World War II, and they love reading about that. And then some of them still love reading what I loved to read I used to read the Babysitter's Club when I was little. But the kids now are reading, they have the graphic novel formats.
What are some of the other titles or themes that are subject to these bans?
Yeah, so the bans, if you look at the American Library Association did a State of Libraries report in 2024. And so if you look at the top 10 banned books, almost every single one of them is either with an author or with characters from the LGBTQ plus community or Black, Indigenous, people of color. Like it's like all 10, and so that's on purpose. That's what they're targeting. It's not a coincidence. Oh, that's just a coincidence. No, it's not. And you look at the books that are being challenged all across the United States. It's the same. It's authors of color, authors from the LGBTQ plus community. Any stories with that point out racism or homophobia or inclusivity, they have a problem with it. And they'll say, oh, these are sexually explicit. And no, they're not. No, they're not. Or they'll say, they're in the kids section. No, you look at some of the books are challenging. Some of them might be tough reads. Like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye is a tough read, but that's not being found in the children's section. That's not next to Green Eggs and Ham. That's in the teen section or the young adult section. And it's, and to me, if you can get married at 16 in Louisiana, but you can't read about racism or sex, that's weird to me.
And in terms of talking about libraries in general, you've been very vocal about how libraries are important in the here and now. But for our audience, could you talk a bit more about how libraries have been traditional sources of democracy in the South, as in how important they've been in previous movements and eras?
Libraries provide resources and not just books for everybody. I mean, now in today's times, libraries will provide Wi-Fi and classes how to use the computer, how to learn English or learn Spanish, or we have other things besides books. We have movies and audiobooks, and you can check out a cake pan and museum passes. But historically, though, libraries have always been have proudly said, we're here for everyone. The library is here for everyone. And, now I don't know because I didn't live in the 50s and 60s, but I don't know that if that was really the case here in the South, if they really practiced what they preached. But if you look at what the ALA, American Library Association, has said that librarians have always stood for, is that access is for everyone. And the books on the shelves should be representative of everybody in the community and even people that don't live in the community, because everybody not only deserves to see themselves reflected on the shelves, but you also want to learn about other people that don't look like you and aren't like you. And historically, I think libraries have done a really great job of trying to provide access to everyone, for everyone.
One of the things that we ask our guests on the show is, what is their idea of the New South? Because obviously that's in our title, thanks to the Levine Museum of the New South. And so one of the things I think we thought about going into this conversation with you is, what can be the contribution of books and libraries and the idea of literacy to what you think the New South maybe should be?
Well, I think literacy is key. You look at, just speaking at schools, every other subject, you have to know how to read. To be able to do all the others, the science and the math and everything. Literacy is so important. It's the key to education. And I think that it's no coincidence that in the South, we have some of the lowest literacy rates. And, we talk about wanting to improve literacy rates in the South, but then you also see the book banning is the highest in the South. And so that's not a coincidence. You want to keep people down, and so you can control them. And I think that if we want to move forward and we want to have a new South for everybody that lives in the South, not just one certain, just not just the white Christian nationalists, literacy is key, and reading and learning and growing, because a lot of people in the South struggle financially and will never be able to travel and see the world. But you can go to the library and pick up a book and you can be in another world instantly. And so that can be life-changing.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. And Amanda, as someone who's a lifelong learner and reader, I want to thank you for everything you've done, and including just your day-to-day teaching, but also pushing back against these book bans, because again, a literate South is a much, much better South for everyone who lives here. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Kaylee Cuoco and Sam Claflin star in the MGM Plus original series, Vanished. When the man Alice loves disappears on a train to the south of France, every romantic memory becomes evidence. Every intimate detail, a potential threat. She thought she knew everything about him, but she may not even know his real name. 4-part thriller Vanished premieres February 1st on MGM Plus. Finding the truth is a dangerous affair.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Our next guest is Robert Cassanello, an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida. His book, To Render Invisible, Jim Crow and Public Life in New South Jacksonville, won the Harry Moore Award in 2014. He has produced films such as The Committee, Filthy Dreamers, and Marching Forward with Dr. Lisa Mills, and the podcast A History of Central Florida and the Florida Constitutions, both of which won the Dunn Internet Broadcasting Award with the Florida Historical Society. Our New South welcomes Robert Cassanello.
Well, Robert Cassanello, welcome to Our New South. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us on our podcast about all things New South. So as always, we like to have our guests introduce themselves to our audience by having you give us your name, where you're at, and what it is you do.
I'm Robert Cassanello. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida. And until recently, I was president of our chapter of United Faculty of Florida, which is our faculty union.
And what kind of courses do you teach at the University of Central Florida?
I teach primarily 3 courses in regular rotation, those being the Civil Rights Movement, another course called Jim Crow America, and a course called Emancipation and Reconstruction.
And you are not originally from the South, but you are certainly a Southerner now. For how long?
I don't know that I call myself a Southerner, but thank you for mentioning that. When you travel to the South, they usually let you know if you're a Southerner or not. And I spent 4 years in Alabama, in Birmingham at a HBCU called Miles College. And all the white folks I met there, the second thing, whenever I was introduced to them, they would always say, "You're not from the South." And it was never a question. It was always just a statement to say, "You're not from here. You're not a Southerner." So I've never ever felt like a Southerner. And certainly growing up in South Florida, I grew up outside of Fort Lauderdale, and that never was the South. It was sort of like a northern diaspora. In the 70s, when my family moved down there, it was actually a New York diaspora. And in fact, we moved down there because a lot of our neighbors from the neighborhood in Queens we lived in moved down there. So I knew all these people from New York from when I was a kid growing up in South Florida. So I've never felt like a Southerner ever. And especially when I did live in the South for 4 years in Birmingham, I absolutely did not feel like a Southerner. So I don't consider myself one.
Yet your studies, your focus have been on all things South, in particular, the Jim Crow South. So what is it about your upbringing and your education has led you to be a student of the South?
Well, there's sort of 2 parts to that question. One is an easy answer. One is just location, right? When I was undergraduate and a graduate student, I worked with a history professor named Ray Moll, and his whole thing was, the most interesting thing for him was the history of his own backyard. So when I went to Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, he was working on articles and eventually a book on Miami, because he just said, "I want to know about the place I live." And so I just started studying Miami, was his response. And so for me, that always was ingrained in me. So I was kind of curious where I lived. And when I was in Birmingham for those 4 years, I did research on Birmingham to get to know where I was. But the sort of longer, more interesting answer to that question is I think my mind was opened in elementary school. I went to Dania Elementary, which is in Broward County outside of Fort Lauderdale. And this would have been 1978, on the 10th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, we had a school-wide program, auditorium. And, I would have been one of the first generations in an integrated classroom in Florida at that time. And the program was headed by the 4 Black teachers that we had, all women. One of them was my teacher, Miss Watson. And Miss Watson actually was from Birmingham and would have been in Birmingham in '63 and would have been a contemporary of the young girls who died in the church bombing. She would have been, that age at that time. And she was my second grade teacher, and she was a Black woman. And, for me, being in, second grade, she was the most beautiful woman I've ever known. She was my standard of beauty. She was the most intelligent person I ever known, because she's my teacher. She taught me multiplication tables, taught me how to spell, all this stuff. So she was both, not only this measure of beauty, but also a measure of intelligence, right? On a young mind, it's really kind of important, and I wouldn't have had that 5 years earlier because it would have been a segregated elementary school, right? I wouldn't have had a Miss Watson. Right. And so Miss Watson and these other African-American teachers took the stage, and they showed us a slideshow, the old slides where you click the button and the slides come up. And it was a slideshow of the civil rights movement. It was a slideshow of pictures from Birmingham, March on Washington, a variety of other things that I later recognized as important moments in the civil rights movement. And these 4 women went up there and said, we approached the principal to give you this program, because an important person died 10 years ago. And because of, his actions and because of what we did in the 1960s, we can be your teacher and you can have classmates that look like us. Because when we went to school, we didn't have any of this. And they just essentially told us from a first person perspective about the civil rights movement. I was, like I said, I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. And they were telling us, we marched. We had to march because these rights weren't given to us. And we couldn't be here with you. We couldn't be your teacher. We couldn't do all of this stuff. And it just kind of opened up this thing in my head. I just was like, what is this? I couldn't grapple with it. Like, how could Miss Watson not been my teacher, right? How could, this person who's like, the epitome of, the smartest person I knew in the world at that time not have been my teacher? And how could, we live in a society where that couldn't have happened, right? And so it planted this seed in me at a very early age that germinated over the course of time. And then, when I went to high school, later on college, I just gravitated towards African American history and civil rights history because that moment, I was always trying to reconcile that moment and what it meant and everything. And so that's sort of, what got me on this path to study Jim Crow and the civil rights movement.
And that's incredibly fascinating. I am pleased to have you on the program this afternoon, especially because history has been in the headlines so much lately. We've already mentioned that you worked at Miles College for a bit in HBCU in Alabama. Could you talk a little bit about how that experience of working in HBCU shaped your career and shaped your life as a historian?
It was a very important stepping stone for me because being at a HBCU opened up all of these opportunities that would not have been there if I was at a majority white institution, and experiences that were there for me if I wasn't at a majority white institution. So I really kind of I think, my early career was formed by those experiences. One of the things that was really important to me, I don't know, I guess I should mention this, but, in fact, Miles didn't hire me to teach history. Miles hired me to teach African American studies. And I taught history as well because I could.
Right.
But that was my hiring. I taught African American studies 3 classes a semester at least, and some semesters if not more. And so I was doing kind of a much broader thing than just history there. And I'm, I have the class, at the time I was at Miles, I think 99% of the student population was Black. So I was teaching African American students, this kind of holistic cultural history and kind of literature and studies approach to, to their curriculum, which was so important to them, right? So it was a real kind of eye-opening experience for me because it really kind of gave me the tools later on. Obviously I didn't stay at Miles, so I went to a University of Central Florida's majority white institution. And so here meeting students of all different backgrounds who say, why should I study African American history? I could say, let me tell you why, because I had this experience at Miles College. This is why this is so important. And not only is it so important, but, because I came in through the studies role, not the history role, it made me think very interdisciplinary. And so when I teach Jim Crow, I teach a civil rights movement. I'll bring music in, I'll bring literature in, and I'll bring all this stuff in. I might not have if I never set foot on Miles College. So I think it made me a much, kind of holistic teacher.
Well, and this is, I think, remarkable because my experience at Claflin was very similar in that when I was first brought there, I also taught a course called African American Heritage, which is, like you were just saying, very much an African American studies class. It introduced all the students to the rich variety and diversity of Black life in America. And this is actually the perfect segue to what we really want to talk about this afternoon in terms of your work right now against the Stop Woke Act. But before we get to that, explain a bit more to our audience why history education, why African American studies actually matters, because it seems for many college students today who are coming to college campuses, they're being told that you should focus on a degree or a program that will, quote unquote, get you a job after college. So why is history, why is African American studies, why are they both so important or should be important to college students today?
I remember when I was at Florida Atlantic University, I was an undergraduate, and I just started in the history major, and the first class I took was, or one of the first classes I took was an African American history class by a man who eventually became my mentor, Kenneth Goings. And I remember the first day of class, he said, like what percentage, and this would have been the early 90s, what percentage of African Americans make up the United States? And, I don't know, 11, 12%, whatever it was at the time. He goes, okay, 12%. African Americans make up 12% of the population. And he goes, but how much impact do they have in them being here makes up American history? Can you give me an example of something in American history that is not connected, defined by, or wholly integrated because African Americans are here in this country? And none of us could, right? And so that was kind of his approach to the class. It was like, this is great. You can learn American history, but you can't take African Americans out of American history because it's so embedded and integrated. It's like, it's just, it's part of the textile of this country, if you will, And so, that's sort of where, I think I come from, with the students here. I kind of, take that lesson from that first day of that first class I take, and I bring it to the students, and I kind of say, okay, here's the challenge. I've never been able to do this. I'm a professional historian now. I can't do this, but this is the challenge. And I think, if they meet the challenge, and they'll come to the same experience that I have and others have. And I think if America at large understood that, right, how much different would the conversations we have around race, the conversations we have about teaching the history of the United States, and I think, frank and accurate ways, right, would be so much easier if people really understood that question.
Given your foundation in teaching from Miles College to what you do at Central Florida, how did you get in the crosshairs, or maybe the other way around, with the state of Florida and how they want to curtail, if not eliminate, the type of history and the type of studies you've been involved with all your life that you just laid out to us is critical to understanding American history?
When what's referred to as the Stop Woke Act or HB 7, they're both the same thing. When those pieces of legislation were passed and were making their way to the governor's office for signature, it was actually before DeSantis signed the legislation. A law firm from Jacksonville reached out to me because I was president of our chapter union here at University of Central Florida. And so they had been calling different presidents around the state of the universities to find plaintiffs that they thought would have standing in the lawsuit. So they, were talking to me on the phone, and they said, do you know anybody who fits this criteria, who teaches classes, who teaches concepts related to critical race theory, to institutional racism, to structural racism? I said, yeah, I do. And so we had, maybe a 45-minute conversation about what I do in class, what I teach, what I hope the students get out of the class, the books I assign, all this other stuff. And they said, we want you to be a plaintiff. And so I said, okay, let me think about it for a couple of days. And I did. And I came back and I said, yeah, I'm willing to do this. And at the time, for about, I want to say about 3 months, I was the only college plaintiff or university plaintiff in the HB 7 lawsuits. And since then, others have come on. But it was important to me to take a stand. It was important for me to be on record to not only defend academic freedom, but defend, a frank teaching, an honest teaching of American history and African American history, especially around race.
And it seems as though the Stop Woke Act has not only had a chilling effect in Florida, but it's being felt across the entire region and indeed the entire country as a template for other states to follow. What do you think has been the impact of this act on education in the South in general? Because it seems that we are at a point now in the South where many of these civil rights stories, including the one you just talked about, are under serious threat of not being taught in schools, or at the very least being severely altered in schools?
The biggest impact, and this is a negative impact, obviously, but the biggest impact I'm seeing is just the success and intimidation. I mean, I've watched this since Stop Woke, right? So I have to be honest with you. I was a little bit confident a couple of years ago because I thought, well, this is just coming down from the legislature. Administrators aren't going to want to enforce this because it's going to make them look bad. It's going to make the universities look bad. Professors aren't going to want to teach in Florida and all this other kind of stuff. And I thought, when it goes to court, there is no jurist that is more absolutist when it comes to free speech than conservative jurists. So I just didn't see it going anywhere. Like, I just saw this as a stunt. DeSantis is running for president. This is what this is all about. And he realizes, this is not going to go anywhere and he's going to pack it in. We're going to move on. But that's not what happened, right? And what happened was lawmakers, along with the Board of Governors, which is the governing agency for the state of Florida over the university system, have really created a culture and policies to intimidate people without pointing to them or without touching their hand on their shoulder and saying, don't do this. They just created an atmosphere. And what I'm seeing is this is working. I see people with tenure, and certainly people without tenure, who are just saying, well, I just won't teach this stuff. I want to sign this book. I won't talk about that. And that's how I'll get around it. For someone like me, I'm not listening. I'm not going to do anything in my class different than what I was doing before, 2022. But I think for a lot of people, they're just tired, they're exhausted. And, quite frankly, now we're living in the age of post-tenure review, which is separate, but it's connected to all this, because what they have to do is they have to make us at-will employees, right? So those of us with tenure who are at-will employees now, because every 5 years we go up for post-tenure review, and then we could be dismissed over post-tenure review. And then all of a sudden we have to say, well, is this worth it? Is it worth it to teach is it worth it to teach the book, The New Jim Crow, in class if it means 5 years from now I won't have a job? That's the calculation people are making. For me, it's an easy question to answer because I'm stubborn and I just won't do it.
One of the things that we ask everyone on the show is, what is their concept of the phrase New South today? And you started talking about how you entered into the field that you're in by, if we look back now, by seeing a New South in the elementary classroom that you grew up in and being exposed to the civil rights movement of the 60s. And that seemed like a progression. But what you're laying out right now sounds like a regression. And so I want to ask you, what is your definition of the New South, and whether or not what you're going through right now, along with other educators in the state of Florida, is a threat to that?
I mean, the term New South has a whole lot of politics attached to it. And there's been many New Souths. When I used to teach Southern history, and when I get to the point after Reconstruction, it would always be the New Souths, plural, because every few generations, there's a New South. The New South, no, we're a different South from that other South. And so for me, New South really has very little meaning to me, because every generation thinks they're new and they're different. For me, what defines the moment we're in, just because I'm a historian and I look things from a longer scope, is Brown v. Board. We're all here because of Brown v. Board, right? Because the Supreme Court in 1954 said it was unconstitutional for Black kids to be in separate schools from white kids. And from that moment brought us to this today, including Stop Woke. Right? This is what we're really kind of talking. This is really what the attack on public education is. And it's all tied up in Brown v. Board. And so I think from that movement, it's been kind of this unwinding, if you will. It was a slow unwinding until 2000, and I think, since 2000, by attacking all of by the conservative movement in this country, attacking all the pillars of civil rights, has really kind of brought us into, the Trump era, where it's become kind of vogue to be publicly racist, to be, publicly challenging, the idea of a racially egalitarian society, not to mention gender and sexual egalitarianism as well. But we're kind of talking about race here. And you can see it in the Stop Woke legislation. I don't know, have either of you read the actual bill, the actual legislation?
I don't think I've actually read the legislation as much as I've read all the reviews of it.
All right, so I'll challenge you and I'll challenge all the listeners to look up the original HB7 legislation. And if you read it carefully, what you will learn is me as a professor in a college classroom, I could, under HB7, teach students and believe that races in America are intellectually superior and inferior to each other. And it would not be a violation of that law. But if I say that one race is morally superior to another race, that's the violation. So why is it that I can go into the classroom and say, intellectually, one race is more intelligent than the other, but I can't say one race is morally superior to the other? That's the kernel here, right? What is it that they're really protecting? What is the speech that they're really trying to preserve, right? I don't think it's an accident that the law is written that way. Because if you look at the Texas legislation, and there was some similar legislation in Kentucky I saw, it was just blanket race. One race is not superior to the other, period, end of day, go home. But in Florida, the moral, one race is morally superior to the other was the modifier. So I could go into the classroom and say, one race is intellectually superior to the other, and I would not be in violation of HB7. I think that tells you all you really need to know about this legislation, this movement, and what they're trying to return us back to. They're trying to return us back to a point where scientific racism, was the rule of the day and governed our policy. That's really what this is about.
What is the state of the lawsuit right now?
The lawsuit right now is in the appellate courts. I believe it's the 11th District in Atlanta. And so there are 3 judges who are looking at the case right now. And this is just about standing. Not about standing. This is just about the fact that Judge Walker imposed that HB7 cannot be enforced, right? The injunction. So what the appellate court is looking at is the injunction. And they're going to decide whether the injunction stays or not. I don't know. I mean, if I were in Vegas and I was gambling, I might bet that the injunction is going to stay. But we'll see, and then it'll go to the Supreme Court. And this is just over the injunction. Once that process is done, okay, then the court case proper can start. So there's actually, altogether, there's 4 HB7 cases. 3 are about university professors. I'm one of the 3. The injunction came about because of the other 2 cases, not from my case, but my case applies into the injunction case. The 4th case is about these private companies that do workplace diversity trainings. And so far, the appellate court agreed with them over the injunction. So that's why it looks good for the injunction for the other cases. And it looks like that case is a little bit further along. So that case probably will be decided first. And then either all 3 of the other cases will go, one of them, 2 of them might go, and whatever the decision in those cases will apply to the rest.
Right.
But we're not even close to the case actually going to court yet. I mean, I would imagine it's not going to end unless, Florida does something to end it, for at least 2 or 3 years at this point.
Wow.
Because the injunction's over a year now, I believe.
Interesting. Well, thank you very, very much for this conversation. This is fascinating. We're glad to see you still in your office doing your thing.
For now. Until I'm terminated.
We hope that won't happen for the education of youth or young adults in Florida.
I have a young, thriving cat to support, so I need this paycheck.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. You know something, Kevin? I think this episode is really quite interesting. The stories we heard from Amanda Jones and Robert Cassanello about standing up and fighting back against censorship in the Deep South were really informative stories. I can't really speak for you, but as someone who works in higher education, these kinds of stories both concern me and also give me some hope because of the fight back against censorship.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that I don't think people realize, that there are people standing up and fighting back. Amanda Jones, the librarian, and has organized others across the state of Louisiana to fight against these book bans in her state. Robert Cassanello, teaching at a major university in the state of Florida under pressure from that government, that administration there. And yet he's not fearful of his tenure. And he knows that the more important fight here is to fight for education for all the students that come to his university. So I think it's a reminder that there have always been and still are today people in the South who would fight back against reactionary forces who want to return the South to what it once was.
You know, we always say the pen is mightier than the sword, and I think this debate on censoring education is an example of that. Both these individuals and many others like them across the South are trying to fight back. And funny enough, the next episode is all about historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, places that have long been bastions of open inquiry, of universal education, places that have produced a lot of folks who have also fought against censorship in the last 100, 200 years of Southern history. So again, I really want folks to listen to today's episode and the next episode as well, because there's a lot of learning left for all of us to do.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofenewsouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to editor and sound designer Kyle Murdoch, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Piñeres, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frankie Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
Thanks for listening.
The South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.